don't have much time, but thank you so much for being here with me. This is an honor. No matter how big or small a space is, it's an important space, I think. So the title of my presentation today is Criticality and ELT in Japan, Reimagining Issues and Approaches to Inquiry and Practice. Now, this is a topic that we could spend 10 years talking about, and I have about 18 minutes right now. So when I go through, there's no doubt I'm going to miss something. There's no doubt that I'm not going to say something that I wish I would have said. Don't hold that against me. If there's something that you want to ask about or you want to talk about later, please feel free to contact me later. And my email address is nrudolph@kindai, kindai.ac.jp. Now, this first picture here that you see is on Taedun Island, or Taketomi Island, which is off the southwest coast of Ishigaki in Yaeyama. And we have our incredible, talented scholar friend here, Madoka, who's going to be talking about this later, about Yaeyama. But I put this picture here to tell you that throughout this presentation, you'll see pictures connected to the lens that I'm talking about in terms of reimagining Japaneseness and otherness. Now, Taketomi Elementary was famous for fighting with the national government about what history could be taught and whether or not their history could be incorporated into the classroom, and they lost. And this challenge in itself was a really serious example of how this overarching idea of Japan as homogeneous is so very powerful, and that people are pushing back as well, but largely without any government support. Okay, a little bit about me. These are my daughters, Lidiana and Nora. They go to Japanese public school. My wife and I are both from the Seattle area in the US originally. This picture here is me at a Yogo Jiro Shisetsu, which is a children's home in my local area. This is probably my proudest accomplishment, is being part of the volunteer program there. And the guy in the middle is John Edwards. He's a Hanshin tiger. So sorry, everyone, but go Hanshin. And John was there with us. We're part of the same church. And I just wanted to highlight this picture because people in children's homes are invisible, rendered invisible. Dozens and dozens of children's homes in my area, and yet most people have no idea who's there and why. Now, in this presentation, I'm going to cover basic ideas of approaching critical scholarship focused on Japan. Number two, I'm going to talk about problematizing idealized nativeness in English and moving beyond a focus solely on idealized nativeness in English. That means this idea of challenging white, Western, male, cisgender ways of being and belonging, and the knowledge and skills and experiences of that imagined individual. So rather than just simply focusing on challenging that in the interest of talking about complexity and diversity and movement and change historically, and addressing inequity and discrimination and colonialism and so on, we're expanding the lens to talk about something bigger today. And finally, I'm going to talk very briefly about language education. Now, this is Koko Makaron. It's a Korean, Japanese macaron shop near my university. My university is near one of the largest Korean Japanese or Japanese with Korean ancestry populations in Japan. And so in this area, it is not uncommon to translanguage in Korean, Japanese, English, and borders in terms of identity, language, culture, ethnicity, and so on blend together in this space. It's a borderland space, as David Blake Willis and Stephen Murphy Shigematsu call it in their book called Borderlands, and talking about Japan as a borderland space. Now, why criticality? For all the reasons I just mentioned, I highlight the why because most people who are not familiar with critical scholarship want to know, why do we have to talk about this? And how does this have anything to do with my students and their success in the future? And so the issue is creating space for different ways of being and belonging, to account for complexity in terms of negotiated identity and interaction. And that involves critical and practical attention to communities. Now, one of the first lenses many of you have probably encountered is the one of juxtaposed nativeness. Now, this is a pseudo critical lens, in my opinion. And what this is the idea that native speakers of English whose identities align with that category, and native speakers of Japanese, we have two categories. These people can complement each other in a comfortable way, and it's a symbiotic relationship. The issue with this is that nativeness is not challenged, the idea of nativeness. And number two, these two categories of people erase complexity. Number one, in terms of being Japanese, but number two, in terms of thinking beyond these categories. People whose identities don't correspond with these categories are marginalized or erased when we talk about this. Now, I say pseudo-critical because, again, this is a very dominant way that a lot of, for example, universities are set up, right? We have a majority Japanese faculty and like 2 white guys, right? And that's not to be rude. It's just, to be frank and honest, if I go to a website and your school is in that type of model, this is what you're going to see. My department at Kindai University is that way, for example. Okay, now the second lens is this idea of problematizing idealized nativeness in English. Quite often people use the term native speakerism. And they talk about the ideology of native speakerism that privileges native speakers whose identities correspond with the category and marginalize non-native speakers. Now, more recently, there's been a push toward talking about complexity. And when we talk about complexity, we're challenging, for example, the idea of who is a native speaker. And so we're talking about things like ethnicity and culture and country of origin and so on. Now, this increasing complexity is focused on, number one, the category of native speaker, and number two, the category of non-nativeness. So it retains the focus or the scope on idealized nativeness in English. And many of you are probably familiar with some of the terms here, critical race theory, intersectionality. We could spend 5,000 years talking about this right now. Not probably a good thing to do, although understanding the roots conceptually of what these theories or lenses say about privilege and marginalization is something to be familiar with. So the idea of whiteness versus color, for example, and this juxtaposition of category, how does that then apply to what transpires in Japan, for example? And this is up for debate. Oftentimes people use terminology in uncritical ways without acknowledging where the history of these different terms can be traced from. That's not to say these are good or bad. What it's to say is these are often used in tandem or together with this apprehension of idealized nativeness in English. Now, my picture here, Ainu then and Ainu now. What I want to talk to you about now is moving beyond simply focusing on problematizing idealized nativeness in English. So recent scholarship has brought attention to the idea that idealized nativeness in English and the maintenance and protection of this idea is situated in contextual negotiations of being and belonging. In other words, when we talk about idealized nativeness in English and a space created for teachers of a specific background, we're also talking about how we imagine Japaneseness and otherness within Japanese society, as well as how we compare and contrast or juxtapose Japaneseness with otherness in terms of the world beyond. And the argument through this lens is that if we solely focus on the idea of problematizing idealized nativeness in English, so we talk about native speakerism and natives are privileged, non-natives are marginalized, or we deconstruct the native speaker category, the question is, how does this attend to the identities and lived experiences of people who are negotiating identity and community membership in Japanese society? How does it connect contextually? Now, I noticed, if you notice here, I said, just to clarify, recent scholarship has brought attention to this. Well, the truth is recent scholarship within ELT and language education and applied linguistics, which I consider domains where people are drawing from different spaces. The issue here is that no, scholars, social movements, and critical voices have been talking about and documenting the negotiation of identity in Japan forever. And so the idea that it's something new to discover is indicative of the idea that we are in a silo in many ways, that we're talking about privilege and marginalization within a silo without looking out into the community wherein our work and our homes, our lives are situated. And so that's a key point to bring up. Now, the idea of homogeneous Japan, of course, is a particular concern, as I know Dr. Hamine will talk about later, the idea of expanding how we think about Japaneseness and the complexity of being many things at once, actually, not just Japanese. No, we don't want to plop someone in a category, but the idea of homogeneous Japan is a dominant narrative to challenge. So if you see here, our lovely finance minister and deputy prime minister Taro Aso, who is very famous for sticking his foot in it with everyone, eloquently describes this worldview that Japan is one nation, one history, one culture, and so on, unlike anyone else in the world, right? Well, this homogeneous Japan idea, it's not just country, it's linguistic, it's cultural, sociocultural, it's religious, it's political, and so on and so forth. And so addressing homogeneous Japan requires much more than just talking about what language should I use in the classroom, or can Nat use Japanese or not? Oh no, he's not Japanese, he can't use it. No, it's much bigger than that in this sense. And this idea of homogeneous Japan is rooted in the end of the Edo period and early Meiji period, wherein Jennifer Robertson, who was born and raised in Japan, but I think her parents were originally from the US, anthropologist, talks about the idea of the conflation of phenotype, geography, culture, spirit, history, and nationhood. And this is what Sugimoto calls the NEC equation. What's interesting, guys, is that quite often the word Yamato Damashi, right? Yamato Nadeshiko, talking about the Japanese spirit or the perfect quote unquote Japanese woman, talking about Yamato, which is historically now, Nara. Interestingly, there was movement in and out of what we now call Nara from the beginning of time, diversity, complexity. Some people might, some people have probably heard that Horyuji, one of the first temples in that area or in Japan, was built in cooperation with Chinese, Korean, quote unquote, we say now, and local people, people we refer to as Toraijin, when we talk about Chinese and Japanese, or Chinese and Korean, sorry. And so the cooperation and the hybridity of culture and interaction in that space, it's pretty interesting that we refer to Yamato as some sort of essentialized or oversimplified space. And of course, you've heard of the word Nihonjin non, or the theories of the uniqueness of Japanese people. This comes out of the early Meiji period as well. Now, of course, it's key for us as language educators to understand the self is contrasted with an idealized other, who in English language education is often, as we've mentioned, white, Western, male, and so on. And this has been unpacked in the literature quite a bit, particularly by Ryuko Kubota early on. Now, the key point here is if I want to address the idea of inequity or marginalization in language education, I'm addressing idealized nativeness in English as well as idealized Japaneseness and otherness as well. And so if I'm looking at textbooks and people often say, oh, you know, I want to create an English as a lingua franca textbook. We need to represent that there are many ways to be an English user. Complexity is referred to as outside Japan, something that is coming into Japan, but there's rarely someone who says, and there are many ways to be Japanese too. And you know what? When you're interacting in Japan, probably 90% of the time, it's not in English, it's in Japanese or it's in another language. And so the idea of a focus on English, idealized nativeness, these things often go hand in hand, which I feel is problematic if we're trying to address this idea of what's going on, who is absent from a textbook, who is present, how are they represented in a textbook, how is Japan represented in a textbook, for example. Now, hiring practices, it's the same thing. So we can look at it and say, oh my gosh, native speakers are so privileged. At the same time, we understand that the majority of faculty in Japan are Japanese, quote unquote. Now, how do you explain that? How do you explain the mechanism of categories of teachers and who's missing? We need to look at more than just idealized nativeness in English to be able to apprehend what is transpiring in those spaces. So one misnomer, one misunderstanding is that when I say this, some people think I'm saying racism doesn't exist. You know, this idea of whiteness is not embedded in ELT. Oh no, it's certainly there. It's certainly bound up with what's happening, but is it the only thing transpiring? Can you explain what's going on in hiring practices in Japan solely by focusing on whiteness? It's a good question, right? And something that people need to explore a bit more. Damian Rivers, who's a scholar up in Hakodate, he wrote a piece about job ads for universities and looking at the requirements for Japanese faculty and for so-called native speaker teachers. Now, in that article, it highlights this idea of exclusive categories and the exclusion of other people. The most job ads being specifically targeted towards Japanese faculty. Okay, so when I talk about identity through this lens, I'm talking about, in many ways, positionality. And positionality is a postmodern or post-structural, some people divide those things, approach to the idea of identity. It's not just fixed, it's not just categorical. You are not Japanese only or less Japanese or more Japanese, but the idea is that you negotiate identity in interaction with others. You position yourself, you position other people, and you are positioned in interaction. And this negotiation is called the negotiation of subjectivity, or the negotiation of positionality, or your positionality. I think this is a really helpful way to think about identity when we talk about Japaneseness and otherness, idealized nativeness in English, because we start to talk about the idea of negotiating identity within and across borders. So borders of language, culture, place, identity, space, time, and so on.
Remaining time at 9 minutes.
Thank you, David. I appreciate it. So this idea here is that borders are constructed, sometimes physical, sometimes discursive, and they demarcate things like correct, valuable, pure, us, and not us. So when people negotiate positionality, when they negotiate a professional identity in their workplace, they're negotiating borders in that space, and that these borders are patrolled by individuals in that place. So a patrolling mechanism can be who's hired, or what you're allowed to do or not allowed to do in the classroom, and so on. And this is what, at the bottom here, I have the word borderland negotiation of identity. This is a way to think about it. So you're not just American living in Japan as a native speaker trying to find a space in your workplace. You are negotiating that idea of Japaneseness and otherness and community membership and so on in that space. Now, why problematize a focus solely on idealized nativeness? My main point here is that quite often the way that we approach idealized nativeness is focused on the language and the concepts of a northern gaze, a northern approach to being and knowing and doing. And so quite often when you have someone talking about some of these concepts related to privilege and marginalization, there is absolutely no connection, no connection or no mention of Japan, which is interesting. So you read an article and you see people talking about, and that's why native speakerism is so, strong, and you can't believe it, people are privileged and other people are marginalized. And we then ask the question, what about students? When they're in the classroom and when they leave and they go home? What about community membership when people come and go? Where are the conversations and the space to be able to connect with that? And rather than telling students who they are we listening? Are we asking? Are we inviting people into conversations? And so this is one reason I feel the lens needs to be expanded. This is really complex. It looks simple. But another big problem, guys, if you read the language or the literature on translanguaging, global Englishes with multilingua franca, quite often it talks about the complexity, the postmodern complexity of language and interaction. And then at the same time talks about people in categories and puts people into categories. So the world is complex and people are constantly negotiating borderland identities. And oh, by the way, these people do this and these people experience that. And so there's a tension between essentialism and anti-essentialism that is deeply embedded in critical scholarship. So very quickly, I just want to highlight a couple of examples of this effect of homogeneous Japan, okay? So the first one is the idea that Japan is monolingual. So erasing the languages of the Ryukyus and calling them dialects, and the language of Hachijojima and Aogashima, Hachijobo, erasing them and calling them dialects, where my daughter comes home from school and says, "No, Papa, no, those are not separate languages that fall under the umbrella of Japonic. No, those are dialects of Japanese," right? And the way things are heading now, certainly it may end up that way. And that's why we're here talking about these things right now, because we care about that. Another thing is dialects of Japanese being marginalized, being, why not learn in Osaka, Ben? Why not, when I go through on my train to work, I go through about 6 or 7 different dialectal areas. Where are the newspapers? Where are the conversations written? Where is the education in this? Well, if you ask people, they quite often say, kawachiben wa chotto kitanai desho, right? It's kitanai. Kitanai, your identity, your lived experiences, your community are kitanai. Well, that's been a very successful job of erasing the value and the beauty of local ways of knowing and being. Another example is the idea that there's one way to be religious in Japan. And so in the 1960s, there was a case in Mie where the mayor paid for a jichinsai, which is a cleansing the ground from spirits, or asking them for blessing. And a bunch of locals sued the government and said, no, where's the separation between religion and state? And the outcome was the Supreme Court confirmed that actually these things are just being Japanese. Now, I'm not talking about Shinto. I'm talking about a certain way of thinking about Shinto, but associating one way of being with being Japanese is one reason that Prime Minister Abe held the G7 summit in Ise, so that all the world's leaders could go to Ise Jingu and find out about real Japaneseness. Now, I imagine somebody sitting on TV down in Yaeyama going, wait a second, hello, down here, right? I think people around the country are doing that actually, but then again, many are not, because this has become normalized. So just a couple of last things here. Third example is Prime Minister Nakasone in the 80s, who called Japan homogeneous or homogeneous, who referred to African Americans in the US as mentally weak and feeble, and talked about diversity as a weakness and the Achilles heel of America, while he also talked about kokusaika, and he also talked about let's return to Yasukuni Jinja because that's where the heart of real Japaneseness lies. And also the idea of the JET program. He was one of the main guys behind the JET program to bring real foreigners and authentic people who we will interact with into the country, right? So that started in the 80s. Just a couple of final things. I highlight this picture here because this picture was meant to send a message through the Jinja Honcho, the Association of Shinto Spiritual Shrines, about the beauty of Japaneseness contrasted with otherness. It turned out that the photo was taken from a website and it's a Chinese model. So you gotta love that. This conversation here about Nippon Kaigi and Shinseiren, these two groups are loosely focused on a return to Meiji era politics and Meiji era notions of Japaneseness and otherness. The majority of Prime Minister Abe's cabinet, Prime Minister Abe, and now Suga, Prime Minister Suga, are all members of both of these groups, as is, of course, Taro Aso. Now, Global Jinsai Ikusei no Kyoiku, the cultivation of global human resources, again, is shaped by this idea of a juxtaposition of Japaneseness and otherness. And so looking at it through this lens, rather than just saying, where are the many different ways to talk about being an English user, because English is the global language, we're actually problematizing the way that we construct selfhood and otherness within education. Now, finally, I have about 3 slides left, so I'll go super fast, okay? This is the CEO, founder of Uniqlo, if you recognize him. He comes from a historically marginalized group, the Burakumin, and his life story and his family's life story, involvement in the Buraku Liberation League, for example, highlights the fact that marginalization and privilege can be fluid. They can be fluid. They're not just categorical, but at the same time, we don't wipe away and say, well, you're privileged and marginalized, so I don't want to talk about this anymore. Rather, we're interested in knowing how privilege and marginalization manifest differently, contextually, in different spaces. So finally, if we're reimagining language education through this lens of talking about Japaneseness as well as idealized nativeness in English, we're talking about Japan as a socio-historical site of movement and change, diversity, and hybridity, and that there are many ways, past and present, of being or becoming a member of this society, and that people imagine that different ways. At the same time, we also recognize this is a default position for many people. So when we talk about this with students, quite often you are rocking their conceptual framework for how they imagine Japaneseness and otherness, which can be quite dangerous. Number two, we're reimagining context and community. As I mentioned before, the idea of not just English, but who's here? The fact that 80% or more of the people living in Japan, 80% or more of the people who Japanese people typically interact with in business and tourism, for example, are from Asia. And it manifests different ways in different places, of course. But the idea of reimagining languaging beyond simply talking about English. And I think this is something that Madoka will talk about later for sure, critically and practically. And of course, reimagining the classroom and communities that they're situated in as characterized by diversity, right? So rather than saying, you are Japanese, you're from this neighborhood, you're from this place, I know who you are, tell me about your experience. We want to know what people are sharing about this, and they may or may not choose to share those things with us. I think the main idea here is we're accounting for the complexity of negotiated identity and interaction, both in terms of membership in Japan, Japanese society, and also in terms of interacting with people across borders. And we want to draw on our community members, our students, and our own lived experiences in doing that. And finally, the idea of reimagining how we approach theory and inquiry. Are we imposing, for example, northern frameworks for being and knowing and doing? And this is something that Alistair Pennycook has talked about a lot. It's not simply about transdisciplinarity. It's not simply about reading some of the literature I mentioned before. It's about reimagining what is viewed as knowledge, reimagining where knowledge comes from and how it is valued. And we're talking about listening and connecting with communities so that that knowledge building and knowledge making become localized and owned by people rather than imposing frameworks upon people to tell them what they're experiencing. The final point here is probably one of the most sensitive, and that is we reimagine or revisit critical assumptions regarding identity and experience in inequity, diversity in education, and interaction. And we acknowledge that if you open up TESOL International's website and you read all of the conversations there, 90%, and by the way, speaking as the former chair of the N-Nest interest section in TESOL, what we can say is these conversations are very deeply focused on North America and talking about issues in North America. Where is the problematization of monolingual Japan? Where is that? Where are people bringing that up? How is TESOL, for example, connecting? The answer is it's not, and it really doesn't need to, right? I think it sort of places the responsibility on JALT and JACIT, right? But sort of, but not really. But at the same time, talks about the idea of in the global field of ELT and things like that, as if all these Western Northern frameworks for knowing and the priorities that are therein are what everybody needs. And that'll solve everybody's problems. And so I think we need to revisit what we mean when we say criticality and how we go about doing it. And that's it for my presentation. Oh my gosh, my nose is running. So hopefully you didn't see that.